Hello and welcome to this Earnscliffe Strategies Post-Election Analysis Panel. My name is Allan Gregg. As usual, I'm joined by fellow colleagues from the Toronto and Ottawa office. They include Rahul Bedi, who was the former Deputy Chief of Staff to the Minister of Finance and the Chief of Staff to a minister who had a really tiny portfolio of economic development, job creation, and trade. Works out of our Toronto office, active in conservative politics to this day. Chris Ball has served as a senior advisor to both Jack Layton and Ontario NDP leader Andrea Horwath. Has worked on a number of campaigns, both federally and provincially. Before joining Earnscliffe, he was the director of communications and media relations at both CBC and Vice Canada. Julie Garner, very active liberal who served on, I think, a small number of portfolios, 5 at Queen's Park over the course of her political staffing career in 4 different ministers. Marianne Carter is our designated non-partisan on the panel. She's got a great in-depth policy knowledge of industries in Ontario, including healthcare, education, transportation, trade. She also has a Master's of Law degree from the University of Ottawa. Last but not least, we are joined by Hilary Martin, who's a senior consultant, a colleague of mine, and Doug Anderson in the public opinion research operations of Earnscliffe Strategies. As good as Doug is, trust me, we're trading up today. She has got some data that we're going to share with the panel and all the viewers. So I'm going to turn it over to Hilary right now.
Thanks, Allan, and welcome everyone. Just to set the stage for my colleagues who are going to get into a bit more of what happened last night and the implications for what's to come for the province. A brief discussion of some polling data that we collected prior to the election. This data is from May 27 to 29, the final week of the campaign, and our top line numbers ended up being quite similar to how the popular vote fell out last night. Small differences within the margin of error, but as we've said throughout the course of the campaign, the most likely outcome was a PC majority, and that's what happened. The race for second place ended up being, in terms of popular vote, a tie almost between the Liberals and the NDP. And we noted throughout the course of the campaign that neither party seemed to be able to break through and really dominate that race for second place in terms of popular vote. But as it turned out, in terms of seats, the NDP's vote share just much more efficiently distributed, and they ended up with far more seats than the Liberals, who have once again not achieved official party status. And the story of this campaign and polling has been one of stability for the most part. Not much has changed, as you can see, from where we were 4 weeks ago to today. But to the extent that there were any dynamic forces at play in the final days of the campaign, we also asked last week voters what their impressions of momentum were over the course of the campaign, which party they felt had the momentum. And we asked this question just a few days ago, and then we also asked it 2 weeks ago. And 2 weeks ago, this is our older data, we see that the PCs led in terms of the party that had the most momentum at 27%, followed by the Liberals at 21%, the NDP at 15%. But something changed in the last 2 weeks, and that's that the PCs number grew to 32% and the Liberals number fell to 15%. And I think this helps shed some light on where we ended up in terms of seats for the NDP and the Liberals. Actually, we've sorted this by partisan affiliation, so sorted by people who said they would vote PC, NDP, Liberal, etc. And I think what's telling is that among Liberal voters 2 weeks ago, 56% felt that their party was gaining the momentum, and just this past weekend, that was down to 38%. And you can't discount that the impact of the impression of excitement and momentum might have on voters to turn out for you, and volunteers as well to help you drive those voters to the polls. And if we look at how PC partisans felt, 63% felt that their party had that momentum. And in terms of NDP partisans, almost half felt the same as well, which was relatively stable from 2 weeks ago. So hopefully that sets the tone for a bit of the conversation that my colleagues are about to have. And on behalf of the public opinion research team, it's been really interesting following along this election. And I'll turn it back to you, Allan.
Thanks so much, Hilary. That's very helpful in setting the table. On our website, there's the full data set that Hilary generated and worked on. And what it indicates, Rahul, is that the PC party put together quite a remarkable coalition of voters, not just in terms of the number of seats or the geography, but I think in our demographic analysis, the only group it was trailing by was 18 to 34-year-olds, even leading among women. I don't think I've ever seen that, quite frankly, in all the years I've been doing polling. But also, as long as I've been involved in politics, there's always been a tension within the Conservative Party between kind of social conservatives and moderates. And that's a tension that's, brought down Aaron O'Toole and Jason Kenney from completely different sides in the last year. I'm wondering whether this victory and the manner in which Doug Ford won this election sends a signal to the broader Conservative Party across the country, and what message they're taking from this.
Well, thanks, Allan. Thank you again to everyone for joining us here today. I think in his victory speech last night, Premier Ford was pretty clear that he and his campaign team took a conscious, strategic approach this election to remake the PC party's voting coalition, one that's less constrained by traditional blue, red, orange, and green buckets, and instead more focused on broader appeal across the spectrum and a willingness to work with everyone to get common goals accomplished, be it the federal government and the Trudeau Liberals, across party lines and other jurisdictions, and things of that nature. And I think the election results speak for themselves. A stronger majority mandate of 83 seats across the entire province, strong results for nearly all incumbents, and in rural Ontario, which has been a traditional kind of base for the Ontario PCs, but also strong connections with new Canadians, including a sweep in all Brampton and Mississauga ridings, as well as the Halton region, a new influx of energy from Ontario workers and private sector unions in key parts of southwestern Ontario and northern Ontario, including some new pickups in the Windsor area, which is pretty unique and interesting for the Ontario PC party. And overall, I think this signals that a conservative message that is practical, positive, and solutions oriented, and importantly balances respect for taxpayer dollars and pocketbook issues, which cuts across, I think, some of those segments you mentioned, with large-scale government-funded legacy infrastructure projects can be a winning formula and proved to be yesterday.
Just as a supplementary to that, because that isn't the message that many conservatives believe is a winning strategy. Do you think this victory can have any impact in influencing the federal leadership campaign that's underway right now?
Perhaps to some extent. I think we have to remember that leadership races are focused on wooing a more narrow subset of dedicated party members, whereas winning a general election usually requires broader appeal. And of course, by its nature, the federal leadership will need to account for unique political nuances and sentiment across all parts of the country, not just Ontario. So there's some differences there as well. But, I do think that Premier Ford's and the Ontario PC successful formula for winning that broad support, and what I touched on earlier, may serve as a bit of a roadmap for leadership candidates who are looking to position themselves as the most electable and who can compete and win against the federal Liberals. So I think there could be something there for people to draw on.
Chris, following the 2018 election, when the NDP won 40 seats, they've been trying to position themselves as a government in waiting. They've also made great acclaim that they had more money this time, more wherewithal to run a juggernaut kind of campaign, yet they lose 9 seats. What's the senior leadership in the New Democratic Party saying right now to the broader membership? What's the explanation for what happened?
Yeah, I think there's like a whole bunch of different conversations happening simultaneously. And so just like, first off, to address the positioning going into the campaign, I think while it's fine to say, hey, we have more seats and we can then beat Doug Ford, there's more legs to that stool. And if your campaign is based on math and math alone, you're kind of doomed. So you need some emotional urgency. You need something more than saying we can win, and so therefore we should win. As far as what the senior folks are saying, I think that depends on who you are as to what you're saying. So first, from a senior leadership perspective, like top of the ticket, meaning the leader, we're obviously saying there's a need for change. And so a leadership contest will make some of that necessary change happen. Internally, I think there's probably a bit of a sense of relief that the damage was limited. And as Andrew Horvath crests out of her role as leader, there's an attempt to kind of position the party is better off than when she started as leader, which is, true from at least a seat standpoint. Central campaign folks will probably be talking today about, the lower turnout, the sleepy campaign, how it was hard for everybody to punch through, but feel somewhat bolstered by the fact that they kept a majority of their seats in Toronto, London, Southwestern Ontario, so that those incumbent seats held. And I think they'll also start to pivot to a message that Liberals continue to struggle over the next 4 years, and so the NDP is still the best way to beat the PCs. One last sort of strain of conversation I think is probably floating out there, because obviously there's a leadership race that's going to start at some point. In maybe some of the non-official circles, there's probably relief again that there's a chance for renewal, but there's a parallel conversation about not necessarily maybe senior leaders, but members, activists, about where we lost and why, about how we lost an incredibly talented MPP like Gurtan Singh, who should be in the legislature, and maybe there were some tactical errors that led to that, and what needs to change to right some of those wrongs. So bunch of different conversations happening on E+1, but that's sort of the nature once you're in the position that the NDP currently stands.
Now, I know it's your job to defend the party, but you're absolutely right. It's not all bad news. I mean, I was really quite amazed that they were able to hold on all of those Toronto seats, and not just in the lower part of the city. This is in Rosedale and Forest Hill. And these are traditional Liberal seats. They held them. Is there something new going on there, do you think?
So first off, I don't think anybody who knows me thinks that I am a grand defender of my party all the time, to be quite honest. I think we should have open and honest conversations about what we're doing right and what we're doing wrong. On the Toronto thing, I think a lot of that comes down to turnout. I think a lot of that comes down to an unmotivated Liberal base who were happy to say to a pollster, yes, I believe again in the Liberal brand because they're not Kathleen Wynne, but aren't motivated to get up off the couch. So like the battle for Team Red in Toronto was not between the Liberals and the NDP, it was between their voters and the couch. And the couch won, it seems, in downtown Toronto as a result of a huge enthusiasm gap with their leader. And so incumbent seats held, and that's again a big sigh of relief from NDP HQ, I would say, but also a place to build. Right, you've got really strong leadership along the waterfront scenes from folks like Margaret Stiles. You've got Peter Tabbins, a longtime incumbent. You've got a lot of the folks from 2018 who held that you can now start to build a base. Kristen Wong Tam, newly elected in Toronto Centre, longtime city councillor, popular person. So there could be a hardening of some of those seats, especially places like Toronto Centre, which would be very interesting. But again, the Liberals lost the battle with the couch, and I think that's probably what ended up happening.
Well, that calls Julie in for sure. I mean, in 2018, there was lots of reasons that everyone could point to why the Liberals did so poorly. You had a big anti-win sentiment. You had a big anti-incumbent sentiment. Fast forward 4 years today, and none of that is really extant. Yet they pick up one seat. Explain that to me. Oops, Julie there?
Apologies for that. And nobody had to say the unmute words to me. Thanks very much. There's a lot of people gathered in rooms today and will be over the coming weeks to analyze what happened during this election. And I think what we're really seeing is the result of kind of some things not happening within the election campaign that the Liberals were hoping in order to steer a path to victory. They really needed, I think, the electorate to be ready to welcome them back to the table again. And I don't think that was totally true. We won back certainly a larger percentage of the popular vote, which is definitely a step in the right direction. But it doesn't look like Ontario was ready to embrace kind of a full scale change. And on change, really, Ontarians are very likely in Confederation have always given the party that they've made a choice to a second chance, at least if you're Liberal or you're Conservative. And I think that especially coming off the heels of a pandemic where the Premier had 200+ media engagements to face Ontarians, to show Ontarians how he was working on their behalf, whether you agreed with him or you didn't agree with him, you knew that he was there and he was working hard. And I think that Ontarians really weren't ready for a whole-scale change and to toss him out on his behind after the effort and the work that he had put in over the last while. I think the third thing that had to happen in order for the Liberals to succeed in this election was it had to be about an issue. And I think that they'll look back and they'll be analyzing every kind of decision they made on policy. They may have doubled down on education a little bit more than they should have, because healthcare and affordability really emerged as the key issues in this election. But really, there weren't any significant, huge policy errors that I think Liberals will say that the campaign team or the leader Stephen Del Duca made during this. It's just a number of things didn't happen. There was no urgency for change. There was no major issue that was really causing people to make a choice in their vote as to which philosophy that they would want to go to. And I don't think they were ready, as I said, to receive them again to the table. So I think there were good strides made in this election, even despite the poor results, but there's still a long way to go. But there's certainly, I think, a bigger light at the end of the tunnel this time.
I was watching the election coverage and just before the polls closed, in fact, and they had a Liberal spokesperson come on, and the commentator said, what are you hoping for in this election result? And he said, we're hoping for official party status. And I thought, what? This is the Liberal Party, so-called natural governing party. Did they see this coming?
Yeah, you could feel it after the debates, after the long weekend. You could start to feel the decline and kind of the energy around the campaign. There wasn't a major kind of issue or kind of mistake that was made. I think some of it happened when there wasn't a knockout punch thrown from the Liberal leader in the debate that caused people to continue that kind of momentum of support that had been building in the 2 weeks prior. And certainly the polling numbers were showing it. I certainly didn't see any of their internal polls, but certainly our polling numbers were showing kind of a loss of momentum and a loss of support that was coming. And certainly the way the lack of efficiency in the Liberal vote certainly means that getting seats and switching seats was going to be difficult for them. So the official the official party status became the new target, which unfortunately they did not make.
Very low bar. It's amazing. But anyway, Marianne, that by all accounts, that Green Party leader Mike Shiner did extremely well in the leaders' debate, yet again did not pick up a seat other than his own, which is kind of an ongoing narrative for the Green Party in the last decade. What's the future for the Green Party right now, you think?
I think, Alan, it's, we could argue this a sort of similar story even at the federal level. But I think there's slow momentum, and I think we'll truly start to see a shift. They were hoping for another seat in Parry Sound Muskoka, and unfortunately, they didn't gain another seat there, but they doubled their fundraising efforts compared to the last election. They made some really attractive promises, such as a $10,000 rebate for electric vehicles. Now that climate and climate policy is more front and center than it probably ever has been, both at the federal and provincial levels, I think if we could say anything, coupled by his strong performance at the debate, is that people are listening and thinking differently. The challenge with our system is, I think there's still the sense from voters that they may be throwing away their vote, and there's still that strategic voting happening. But if you look at different ridings, there's certainly been an increase in voters thinking twice about some of the traditional parties. And
he's been proven to be an effective critic, particularly on the environment in the legislature. So while I think it's not the result they had hoped for, they still got a lot of positive traction, particularly by his unexpected strong performance at the debate.
Rahul, I want to start with you, but then I want to bring the rest of the panelists in to talk about what this outcome means for the dynamics of party politics in general, in Ontario specifically, and Canada larger. I mean, what happened here is that the Conservatives not only increased their majority, they won NDP seats. In over 45 years of watching politics, I have never seen a PC ad attacking the New Democrats. You look where they won. They won in the Windsor area, Hamilton area, Timmins, and Brampton. These are ridings that represent disproportionately blue-collar workers and or new Canadians. These are not voters who have normally gravitated towards the Conservative Party. In fact, there's an argument that they have never seen this kind of coalition forge under the Conservative banner. How significant is this going forward, do you think?
Well, I think it's significant. And, as we've discussed, I think it indicates the emergence of a successful new voter coalition for the PCs. It's not an accident, and I don't think it happened overnight. Well-deserved kudos, has gone, particularly throughout this election and its aftermath, to Minister McNaughton, who prioritized these relationships with workers in particular, and the private sector unions when he took over the labor training and skills development portfolio a few years ago. This led to much publicized, 8 endorsements during the election period from private sector unions, which was for the Ontario PCs, which was previously unheard of, and a seal of approval from Pat Dillon, who was a former leader of the Working Families Coalition, who had sort of previously served as the bane of the Ontario PC's existence over many successive elections. But beyond that, it wasn't just talk; it was also action. So during their time in government, they delivered significant economic development policy priority wins that directly appealed to these regions, whether it was the resurgence of the auto sector, which saw over $14 billion in new investments over the past 18 months, a big focus on critical minerals and connecting supply chains in northern and southern Ontario, and bringing back Northlander passenger rail, which was a big deal for parts of northern Ontario, particularly Timmins. And of course, and perhaps most importantly, Ford and the Ontario PCs have focused on building housing, transit, highways, including the well-publicized Fort 13 and the Bradford bypass, which were key wedge issues, particularly in the Peel region, and new manufacturing capacity, ensuring plentiful, good-paying jobs for both sort of the blue-collar workers you described, but also more broadly, the hardworking new Canadians who reside in these key strategic ridings. So, I think if this trust that's been developed and this policy direction remains, I think we could be seeing a structural change in voting coalitions. And obviously, I think that would be a very significant development in Ontario politics going forward.
Well, I want to talk to Julie and Chris about the implications for the Liberals and the New Democrats, both of whom traditionally relied on working people and new Canadians as a cornerstone of their kind of constituency. Julie, does this mean that the Liberal Party has to start really rethinking what it stands for and who it represents?
This election really wasn't about, again, policy and what we represent and what we don't represent. If it had been a choice, I think people would have looked at the policies a little bit more closely and perhaps more would have selected either the Liberals or others that were putting forward innovative ideas. I think where this really, certainly the inroads with new Canadians are significant. I think the inroads with the trades community, to kind of Chris's earlier point, Minister McNaughton did do a great job in his portfolio and really kind of reducing the red tape around training programs. There's tons of money going into retraining right now in the economy, which was one of the biggest asks. When you have funds that size and that flexible to operate for training, you're going to end up building a coalition of support, which is exactly what he did. Where I would caution is that there is still 4 more years, and now you're governing again. You've got the endorsements, and these organizations are built to service their members and to make sure that they're continuing to make progress. So there's going to be a long list of asks that comes along with those endorsements that the Conservatives are going to have to weigh, and they are going to be challenging at times. Again, there's been some good stakeholder relations work done in the last 4 years, but it's going to get tougher. And that was my experience, certainly working alongside many of those unions for a long time. Around kind of some of the issues and the dynamics over the next 4 years, I think the next 4 years is going to be really tough. And I don't envy those that are sitting, that are going to be filling the seats at Queen's Park. I think healthcare is going to come to a crisis point because it has been neglected. Certainly we've put some Band-Aids on things, but there's going to have to be a lot of transformational public policy done over the next number of years. And it's going to take a lot of ambition in order to do it. I think also we're going to see affordability in the economy. Affordability concerns increase, and also potentially an economic downturn, which could spell some significant trouble for the government as well.
I want to focus on the legislative agenda in a second, but first I want to ask Chris basically the same question in terms of the New Democrats. I mean, we've seen in the States, for example, the Democrats having a hard time with blue collar workers as well. I mean, how much does this cause the NDP grave concern and to rethink how they're approaching their role in political life?
Yeah, I mean, there was a poll that was out a couple of days before Election Day that had 62% of union households, not just private sector, but also public sector, not voting for the NDP. And that's not good news. But at the same time, you kind of see, major public sector unions endorsing us. We're shaking hands as leadership. They're at Queen's Park. We're passing legislation on their behalf. But yet again, 62% of union households, private or public, aren't voting for us. So there's a disconnect, right? And we got to fix it. And I think it's just we need to get a better sense of who those target voters are and how we talk to them about progress in terms that doesn't make folks feel like they always have to give something up in order to gain something, right? So I point to the 413 debate, right? So there's a big debate around the environmental impact of the 413, and I believe environmentally maybe not the best policy. But there are working people in Mississauga, in Brampton, in the GTA, who are sitting in their cars, and we are saying, no, we don't want you to get your job quicker, right? And so I think there needs to be a better sense of who that voter is on the NDP side. I've spoken about this in past webinars, so folks who've tuned in before, please don't roll your eyes. But there used to be this old Venn diagram, right, of Sun Reader, which was kind of code for working class broadsheet thing, union member, and NDP voter right smack dab in the middle. And that Venn diagram no longer exists, right? And so there's a bit of bringing that back together, but also understanding that unions aren't monocultures, right? Like just because the activists and leadership are saying vote this way doesn't necessarily mean that the rank and file are there. So we need to reach down. We need to reach down that other level into the rank and file and get a real better sense of who these folks are and what's motivating, but it's also what's the disincentive for voting for the NDP. So there's a bit of a project there for whoever's next.
Marianne, I talked to Rahul off the top about a long-standing tension between social conservatives and moderate conservatives. Given this new dynamic, given a conservative party that's able to attract blue-collar workers, new Canadians, we also saw in this election the New Blue Party and the Ontario Party spin-offs of the Progressive Conservative Party trying to adopt a much harder right-of-center position, anti-vax, anti-mask mandate, arguably some other things that are not particularly palatable to progressives. Does this new dynamic open up new terrain for splinter parties and a hard right party to kind of manifest itself and emerge?
Certainly. I think we're certainly seeing that at the federal level, and there's no doubt we're similar to having those types of sentiments, similar to the United States and elsewhere. I think one of the things that came out of the last federal election is that there was a group of conservatives, particularly social conservatives, who felt their party wasn't as conservative as they could be. And I don't think it's just a social piece, but it on the economy, but also particularly, we can't deny that the pandemic has painted an opportunity for those in Ontario who feel very strongly about the vaccine mandates. I mean, look, I'm sitting in our office in Ottawa, and a couple of months ago, I couldn't go into my office because there was a trucker convoy that quickly turned into something different. That was a group of people in particular who had strong sentiments about vaccine mandates. And a lot of those people, the data shows at least, are joining some of these new splinter parties, both at the federal and provincial levels. It goes deeper than that. You know, we're seeing, and again, similarly, like in the United States, about gender identity politics being taught in schools, just very strong views on a particular type of path that certain types of government are taking. And then you look at the ongoing, and as we've discussed in previous webinars as well, relationship that is being built and strengthened between the Prime Minister and Premier Ford. And so I think there is certainly a sentiment that there's people who don't feel like they have a place for their voices to be heard in traditional conservative circles. And I don't think that's going away anytime soon. While, you know, that not successful in terms of, you know, having that voice well represented in the legislature, that I think we'll continue to see those that pushback and that sort of part of the parties grow and build in different ways over the next few years.
I forgot to say off the top that anyone who is tuning in to this webinar is welcome to ask questions to either individual panelists or the panel as a whole using the Q&A function at the bottom. And I guess that someone has probably done that anyway. Marianne, you've been monitoring that. Do you have any questions that you want to pull out of there?
Yes, there's a couple questions on voter turnout, Alan, and we should probably address this.
Sure.
And I'll just sort of paraphrase because they're all sort of similar, but someone wrote, low turnout seems to be a major story to me. What do you think explains it? People don't think that their vote matters?
Rahul, why don't you start there? I'd be interested in all of your points of view on this. But I mean, there was many who alleged that Doug Ford wanted a low turnout campaign. He wanted a campaign that didn't have any particular controversy or issue focus. Did that have anything to do with it? Like, I think it was a 42% turnout, lowest ever in Ontario?
Yeah, I think it was close to 43%. I think Julie captured it with one of her earlier comments. I think part of the reason for the low voter turnout was there wasn't a real sentiment to change driving through this election, really, you know, from any of the parties or any of the different parts of the electorate. And so, you know, from that perspective, people were seemed generally happy with the status quo. You know, the polling suggested from beginning to end what the outcome would be. And I think that also, to some extent, seemed like a foregone conclusion to a lot of folks on the ground as well. And so at the end of the day, a lot of folks, you know, decided to stay home. And I think that was part of the rationale for it.
Julie, Chris, you want to talk about the turnout rate at all?
I'll just kind of add that I think the pandemic really played a role in it too, in the sense that government's played a big role in people's lives over the last 2 years. And I think in Ontario, people are tired and just want to go back to living their life and don't want to have to do something because they've been told to do it, especially kind of by a government. So it's just a bit of exhaustion. It's not an anger statement. There was no, as Rahul said, and as I said earlier, there was no big change mandate here. And I think people are tired and just tired of the obligation of kind of life that has kind of been imposed on them the last number of years because of the pandemic. So I think that certainly factored in as well.
Chris, I mean, many people see turnout as a proxy for kind of belief in the democratic system. I mean, is that at work here right now?
I don't know. I think this is a bit of this is an outlier. There's a bit of there's the pandemic fatigue. It's nice out. People are happy that they get to go and sit on a patio. Like our patio's great now, and they get to be with their friends. And like the last thing that they're really thinking about right now is the electoral system. And I think I'm willing to give Ontarians a bit of a like, okay, it's like that was okay this time around. Also, like there's a bit of a pox on the opposition parties for not even trying to drive urgency in this campaign, right? And so, people are motivated to go to the polls and they feel like there's something urgent at stake, right? And at no point in this election did any of the opposition parties do anything to particularly create that sense of urgency, either going into the campaign, during the campaign. And as a result, like nobody, like why would they feel motivated to go to the polls when generally the narrative that was that kind of was allowed to sink in was that Doug's got it, like it's fine, right? And so I don't know if it's a disconnect of Ontarians from their like day-to-day lives. What I will say though is that there are a lot of people out there who are probably feeling a bit of a diminishing returns in their day-to-day lives when it comes to when they put their little ballot in the ballot box there. A lot of people aren't seeing themselves get ahead like previous generations did, who were so allied to going to the polls and voting for things. And so I think maybe that plays a bit into it. A lot of people are feeling a bit lost right now. And so why would they vote? Because they're not seeing as much of a return on investment in their day-to-day lives. So I think there's a lot going on, but I'm still hopeful for our democracy because, man, we've been through a lot the last 2 years.
Marianne, you want to jump in here?
Yeah, I think in politics, timing is everything as well. Imagine if this election was last year. I think the level of frustration, anger has subsided over the last several weeks in this province, which has benefited Ford. And just to build off my colleagues' points in terms of they're not like the urgency to go out and vote, especially when you look at the polling numbers and it not appearing close anyway. But I think it would have been a very different story, how many businesses were impacted from closures, lockdown, mask mandate, or like various views. Parents frustrated with their kids staying home from school, all that sort of stuff didn't play out in the same way it could have, 10 months ago, even a few months ago, if the election had been held earlier this year. So it really just demonstrate how, voters in this country tend to vote governments out and not in. And this was more about, well, Ford guided us through this. And, he's right before this election, he's making childcare announcements with the Prime Minister and investments on electric vehicles and these sorts of things. So it wasn't enough to make people want to do a change vote. And in fact, it actually allowed people to say, well, he didn't do such a bad vote. Or a bad job. He has my vote this time around. So.
Chris, something is changing, and that's leadership. This is Andrea Horwath's fourth kick at the can, and now she's announced that she is going to resign as leader of the NDP. What kind of leader, what kind of leadership attributes is the NDP going to be looking for, and who might be some of the candidates who might be considered early front runners?
I'm glad you asked because I have a checklist and I brought it to this webinar. So first off, like I think first and foremost, in any political party and any change of leadership, you need somebody who wakes up every day wanting to be premier of this province and will do anything to be premier of this province because they know that if they did that, they could change a whole whack of people's lives for the better. So they want to win not just because they should win, but because they are the agent of change. And so I was fortunate to live through a bit of that, an anecdote, if you'll allow. My old boss, Jack, when I left, I wrote him a little note saying, thank you literally for changing my life and helping me kind of like set this great path. And his response wasn't thanks for the great work. It was thanks for the great work. And I'll be calling you when I'm sat in 24 Sussex and we're assembling the greatest team that will ever govern this country. So that type of like singular mindset permeates throughout a team. It creates excitement. It creates motivation. It creates different strategies that you're willing to try to actually achieve that goal. Second, I think we need somebody who's going to actually understand the problem that we have, beyond just like the easy bromides of like, we need to be more progressive, or we just need to be bolder. Like, we need to like really dig in, as I talked about earlier, into like, who is our voter actually, and who could our voter actually be? You know, I go back to that 62% of union households who aren't voting for us. Let's look at those suburban ridings where we kind of fell into the 413 highway trap, and we can debate obviously, the purity of an environmental message from the NDP, and that's a good moral thing, but we are talking about politics here, and how do we connect with those voters in a way that we're not telling them, hey, your car is a vehicle of Satan, and we want to take it away from you. We need to talk about how do we bring you along on that journey with us. And so just finally, pick a lane and build a brand, right? And so I'm not sure folks would necessarily even say that the formulator was like strongly tied to a particular issue that defined them, right? Mm-hmm. When you pick a lane, when you pick a big challenge, it not only is about the policy, but it's about how it defines you as a person. It defines what fight you're in, who you're fighting for, and who you're fighting against. And so I think what we've done in the past is kind of go into focus groups and say, hey, you like healthcare, you like education, how can we get you to agree with us on those things that we all agree on, versus saying, here's my strong point of view about what we can do together as a party and as a province. Here is what it means to be a New Democrat now. How do we now get you to come from here over to here and meet us there, right? It's that persuasion versus validation piece that we've been missing, and that Conservatives have done a fantastic job of doing. Here is our worldview. Here is where we're going to be. We're going to build highways. We're going to build jobs. How do you come along with us and feel invested in this fight? So those are my three things. As to whether or not, like, there are some front runners out there that people talk about, like Joel Harden's name is being tossed around, Marit Stiles' name, at least in downtown Toronto, you hear a lot about her as a potential candidate. But for me, it's about the checklist. And if you're ticking the boxes on that checklist, then that's thumbs up for me.
Julie, notwithstanding what Stephen Del Duca said before the election results came in, I mean, he lost his seat, or he failed to win a seat, and immediately again announced that he too would be resigning. So the same kind of question I asked Chris: what leadership attributes is the party going to be looking for, and who might be able to fill those shoes?
Yeah, Allan, thanks very much for the question. I think, going back to Stephen Del Duca and what he's done over the last 4 years, I think really when the party selected him to be the leader, they selected him because he was going to be a steady hand. He had a deep organizational background, and he could rebuild a party that was decimated in 2018. Now that the building blocks are back there, the foundation is kind of rebuilt within the party, and the financial situation is definitely much healthier than it was, thanks to that organization. The party really has the opportunity to choose change and to choose to renew. The real question will be whether or not it's somebody from within or somebody on the outside. My sense is that Ontarians really want to see something new and different from the Liberal Party. They want also to be seen, and I think, towards the tail end of the Wynne government, they stopped being seen by that government, and the government had lost that connection. So they're going to need to see somebody that's able to recapture that connection within. But the challenge is that it's very difficult, and just the way that the conventions work and the selection process from within. Somebody with an organizational base like a federal cabinet minister, or somebody with the federal Liberals might have a better chance than somebody coming in from the outside that's not as well known in terms of being able to build the membership support that will see them cross the finish line. So it should be, certainly it's going to happen as soon as possible from what Stephen said last night, but at the same time, it's going to take a little bit of time to get people interested, get people back on their feet. I think we're going to see names come forward like Mitzi Hunter, who ran in the last one, likely again from Kate Graham. But I think we might see some new faces as well. And I know there's lots of conversation around Jeff Lehman, the mayor of Barrie, who just narrowly lost to a very popular Conservative cabinet minister in Barrie, Springwater and Oromonte last night. So lots of kind of interesting names being tossed around today, but I think people are just kind of taking a deep breath and looking at it. It means a lot, especially given that the majority of the contenders will not have seats in the legislature.
We talked to Rahul about the challenges facing the Liberals in the NDP, but Doug Ford has a challenge as well, one that he perhaps welcomes, but it's not going to be easy, and that's building a cabinet with 83 members. Talk to me about that. What goes into the whole process of choosing a cabinet, and what might we likely to see in kind of the first months of this new administration?
Yeah, well, in terms of a status quo outcome, we're likely going to see, a quicker post-election transition, and kind of getting back to the business of government, things like lifting the caretaker convention, these sorts of things that matter in terms of those looking to work with government, things that we'll be watching for. As you mentioned, within government, and as is the case following elections, there will be an immediate focus on rejigging cabinet. As we discussed, I think on a previous webinar as well, it's sort of a balance. You want to reward strong performing incumbents. In this case, I think across the electoral outcome, nearly every incumbent will be returned. And so you want to reward those strong performing incumbents, but also make room for the new, fresh talent. As a given, we know that Deputy Premier and Health Minister Christine Elliott, who played a very important role around the cabinet table, particularly during the COVID pandemic times, will no longer be there. She chose not to reoffer for election, and that in and of itself will trigger a large set of dominoes that we'll be watching for, given that's a big hole to fill. Getting it right is very important for a couple of reasons. One, obviously you want the best team in place to hit the ground running, to implement and sell the Ford government second mandate priorities. But it's also a very important caucus management exercise. And so, with 83 caucus members now, you have 7 more than you had following the 2018 election. That's just, 83 personalities within caucus, 83, different sets of ambitions who all see themselves around the cabinet table that you have to manage. And so those will be some of the key things that they'll be looking for, as well as some of that those new regional dynamics that we discussed. So you now have, for the first time in a long time, in a PC government, representatives from Windsor and more representatives from Northern Ontario. So you'll likely see a little bit more regional representation there around the cabinet table too. From an issues perspective, more broadly, I think Julie raised it. Once the bubble of the election period pops, there are some serious issues facing, I think, Canada broadly, and obviously here in the province, including affordability concerns, cost of living, our healthcare sector, et cetera. And so I think, instilling economic confidence in the face of those affordability concerns and inflation will be a top priority for the Ford government in its early days. For example, again, as we've discussed, there is a legislated 5.7 cent reduction in the gas tax. Right. That's set to start in July. So there will be, I'm sure, some marketing and trumpeting of that in advance, and coupled with some of the previous measures that the Ford government campaigned on, including putting more money in people's pockets, cutting those license plate sticker fees, things of that nature. And the other key thing, obviously, that we'll be looking for is the retabling of the budget and the related legislation. And so, as we remember, right before the election, the budget was tabled by the government, but was not passed pre-election, and instead kind of served as the election platform for the Ontario PCs. The timing will obviously be very important of when it's retabled, given it really does serve as the fiscal and policy roadmap for government. And so again, just briefly, what we'll be watching for is the timing. I think there's really 2 tracks. One will be whether the legislature is reconvened over the summer to table and pass the budget, or will they wait until the start of the fall session to do so? I think there's pros and cons to either approach. That'll be weighed strategically, based on precedents following the 2018 election and other incidences there. Premier Ford really does, is sort of biased towards action, and so wanting to reconvene the legislature, indicate that the government is getting, hitting the ground running in terms of working, and so convening to pass the budget quickly, will be one element. But you want to balance that with the fact that if you do have a fairly significant new makeup in cabinet, that you want to arm those new cabinet members with a bit of time to learn their portfolios, get staffed up, understand what their priorities will be, what is in that budget that they'll have to be selling and or defending, and things of that nature. And if you are to wait until the fall to retable the budget, obviously there's a fair amount of time there for new economic or political dynamics to come to the forefront that you may need to account for in that budget that you may want to solve in the immediate. So those will be some of the things I think that they'll be looking at internally.
Chris, Julie started going down this road a little bit, but and I want to bring her in again after this as well as Marianne. But when you're confronted with a huge majority, like the NDP and the Liberals have, nothing's going to change substantively for the next 4 years. But it's hard to even establish relevancy as an opposition. You got to pick your punches very, very carefully. What do you anticipate the NDP are going to focus on as the legislature comes back?
There's going to be a few things that happen. First off, we're going to appoint an interim leader. And so that interim leader usually is someone not seeking the leadership. You need someone who is respected by the caucus. You need someone who provides a bit of consistency while your caucus and others are looking to kind of suss out their plans and start to kind of send messages about what needs to change and all this stuff. And so there's a bit of a steady as you go approach that tends to happen when you've got an interim leader in place. And so you're probably going to see continued focus on some of the campaign narrative, like vigilance on cuts, focus on healthcare. They'll track the affordability piece to see kind of, is there a real shift there with the, coming into the massive PC majority. And so, but there's nothing new there. I think the new will have to be set by the new leader. And I think you can't, in the context that we're currently in, you can't really short circuit that process by having an interim leader who goes in and says, we're going to start fighting for a million new different things, because you need the party and you need the new leader to help define some of that. So don't expect too many shifts, I don't think, unless something massive happens in the next 6 to 8 months, but pretty standard fare, I would say.
Julie, you started talking about this. You got any further thoughts about what the Liberals, no leader in the legislature, leadership camp came under? Are they going to be focusing hard on policy, do you think, in the first little bit?
I'd just like to take this a little bit of a different direction and just to comment on kind of the NDP's strategy and where I think it was ineffective. I think all opposition parties owe it to the voters not just to complain about what the government may be doing, but also to offer constructive solutions. So I think that the Liberals, to the extent that they did that through the pandemic, I think it was actually seen as a positive thing. We were always told, when I was working in government, that one of the chief criticisms of the Conservatives was that for many years they talked about what was wrong with the problem, but didn't put forward any solutions. I saw Andrea Horwath very much doing that over the last 4 years, and I think it really turned voters off. And so for both the Liberals and the NDP, I think they've got to hold the government to account, and the Greens as well, hold the government to account, but offer alternatives in terms of solutions for voters to consider, and voters to consider that there are alternative ways of looking at issues, especially substantial issues like seniors dying through COVID, or kids being cut off of autism funding and autism programming, as Dorothy's pointed out in the questions. So I really think the constructive solutions have to be advanced forward. Really, I think, as Chris said, there's going to be an interim leader. It could be John Fraser again, as he was reelected in Ottawa South, and certainly If that is the case, they'll do their best to kind of point out and hold the government's feet to the fire on things that they don't support that are happening on behalf of Ontarians, and offering that perspective.
Marianne, you've been watching legislatures for years. What are you going to be looking for coming out of Queen's Park in the first term?
Yeah, and it actually kind of builds on a question a viewer asked about around housing, and maybe if we have time we can touch on it, but it's still going to be the affordability pieces. I think they're really going to have to come together and find paths forward in on a variety of fronts, whether it's talking about housing, getting to work, how that looks. It's still on the top of minds of voters, and it's not going away anytime soon, particularly with the Bank of Canada once again increasing its interest rate a few days ago. And so I'll be really watching to see some of the key pieces, and particularly how they lead up to their next budget, and how they'll be supporting Ontarians on that front.
We only have about 5 minutes left. Are there any other questions there that you want to raise with the panel?
Yeah, and so I think, and maybe we can just build on this a little bit. So when viewer asked about that the recent interest rate increases from the Bank of Canada will undoubtedly take some of the steam out of the housing market in Ontario, but at the expense of making mortgages more expensive for households to carry. Can we expect anything more from this government in terms of housing policy? I feel like that's directed at Rahul.
Sure. Happy to jump in. There's obviously a federal component to this that as we've discussed at length. I think the Ford Ontario PCs and the Trudeau Liberals have developed a good working relationship, and so I don't expect the province to be confrontational with the federal government and delve into any of the dynamics that we're seeing to some degree within the federal leadership race vis-a-vis fiscal policy, and then in this sense monetary policy and the Bank of Canada and things of that nature. But nonetheless, the rising interest rates, as the question indicates, will have a significant impact on the housing market to some degree. Making affordability for newer entrants easier over some period of time, but providing a bit of crunch for those that are holding mortgages. Just to answer the question specifically, I think the one thing to look for will be how the government sort of looks to implement more of those reforms from the housing task force that they had put together before the election. So as we remember, a couple months before the election, Minister Clark and the province brought together the municipalities, all 444, and their respective groups, AMO and FNOM and Roma, as well as the federal government, for a bit of a summit to kind of get at the heart of these issues, understanding that there is a multi-jurisdictional element to this. And they also struck a task force chaired by a senior leader from Scotiabank and representatives from across the spectrum, who put together a number of recommendations, some of which they did implement prior to the election through a piece of legislation and further funding for municipalities and things to expedite streamlining and developments at the municipal level, certain things around zoning as well, and other sorts of changes. But there were certain elements that were recommended that get more at the heart of the NIMBYism element at the municipal level, in particular regarding right-of-way zoning, exclusionary zoning, multi-residential zoning by right-of-way in particular, that was not tackled directly, because it is, I think, a bit of a crunchier conversation with the various levels of government and with homeowners in particular who live in the suburbs and have single-family residential houses at the moment. And so, what I'll be looking for is how and if the province looks to act on those remaining set of recommendations that they already have at their disposal from that task force.
Chris first, and then Julie. Is affordability and rising interest rates an opportunity or a problem for the NDP and the Liberals? Chris?
I think it's an opportunity for both opposition parties to, hammer at the current government and, to Julie's point, put forward positive solutions to try and overcome that, even though we did do that during the pandemic, including launching our LTC plan in October 2020. Had to get that in, sorry.
Last word to
but-
Julie. We're almost done
ahead.
here in terms of time.
It's going to be a challenge. It's going to be a challenge. It's going to further stress finances and in families and create some big challenges in terms of how our people are feeling about their economic outlook, for sure.
Thank you all, fellow colleagues. Thank everyone who tuned in. Those who didn't get to your questions, we will write back to you and give you some fulsome explanation of our point of view on the questions that are asked. So with that, thanks all, and take care and be well.